Hello and welcome to Rationally Rating. I'm Daystar Eld.
And I'm Alexander Wales.
And today we're going to be talking about what is rational rating. For those who don't know who we are, I'm the author of Pokemon: The Origin of Species, which is still ongoing, and various articles and reviews on the internet. I also wrote Daystar's Remix of Rationality, an expansion of the first 4 chapters of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality to smooth out the early part of the story and add context for those not familiar with the canon.
Yep, I really like those, by the way.
Thanks.
So I wrote Metropolitan Man, I think it's the most popular thing. Branches on the Tree of Time, A Bluer Shade of White. I think those are probably the top 3 right now. I wrote Shadows of the Limelight, which is complete web serial, and I'm writing Glimwarden right now. I also write a lot of short stories that are not as involved or complex, just a page or two about the logistical operation of the Death Star 2 or things like that.
That was fantastic, yeah. So, what is rational writing? First off, when we talk about rational writing, we're talking about fiction that falls under the genre of rational or rationalist. And to me, rational fiction is fiction that does its best to ask questions about its world and characters' choices and provide answers that make sense and are consistent with each other. What would you define it as?
I have a couple different definitions. I think the one that I go with most often is that rational writing is about not using artistic license. There's a rule of cool where the audience is willing to suspend their disbelief if something is sufficiently cool. They don't care whether you have a flaming laser sword or like jetpack boots. As long as it's cool enough, they'll accept it. And rational fiction is mostly about not taking that artistic license and earning the cool moments instead. Or the same applies to the rule of drama or the rule of romance and things like that.
Yep. And the reason I'd consider it like a genre in and of itself is because it kind of evokes a specific intent in the story writer and taste in the readers. Like, there's the setting kind of genres where sci-fi lets you know that there's going to be space battles or advanced technology or some kind of exploration of scientific principles. And there's the fantasy, which is magic or medieval times or some alternate world. And that's different from what I would refer to as the intent genres, like romance or mystery. Like mystery genre is about there's a crime, there's going to be evidence, there's going to be hints, and the reader can try to solve them and figure out who committed the crime. And that's kind of similar to the rationalist genre in the sense that whenever there's something going on in the story, the writer is trying to purposefully make them understandable, make them predictable, so that the readers can follow along.
Yeah, and one of my other definitions that I use for rational fiction is that it's thinky fiction. That there's some element of thought on the part of the author or the reader, and you're not just supposed to consume it like popcorn. It's not a Michael Bay type of experience.
Yeah, it tends toward more introspective characters, at least the protagonist, which I guess raises the question then is the distinction between rational writing and rationalist writing. So maybe we can say rational writing would be, a method of writing, while rationalist writing is the genre itself.
I think rationalist fiction is more about subject matter to some extent. It's specifically about learning and science and certain other thinky things, right? That might be my very loose definition, is that rational writing is thinky writing, and rationalist writing is writing about thinky things. It's sort of a subject matter and style distinction to some extent.
Yeah, so I guess we could say that rational writing or a rational story is one where the writer is not giving in to convenience or rule of cool and is trying to answer all the possible questions that might come up about their world and characters' choices, and that a rationalist story is one where you've got at least one character, probably the protagonist, who is themselves explicitly trying to figure things out and think deeply about things. and examine their thinking and their biases and solve problems.
Yeah. One of the things that I've heard commonly about rational fiction is some people think that it's too synonymous with good writing, because we have that bullet point list on the sidebar of the Rational subreddit. And in brief, it is nothing happens because the plot requires it. Factions are driven into conflict by beliefs and values. Characters solve problems through intelligent application of knowledge and resources. And the rules are sane and consistent. And a lot of people will say that that's just
good writing.
Those are just writing tips for good writing. But I think the big difference there is that. Sorry, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this.
It's okay. One thing that can be said is the distinction between good writing for the purpose of teaching the reader something about rationality or thinking or their own biases is somewhat different qualitatively than the distinction between just not doing writing that doesn't make sense or plots that don't make sense.
Yeah. I guess what I would say is that rational fiction is distinct from good writing in that I think that you can have good writing and break rules. I think rule of cool is perfectly fine. I sometimes shake my head at it if I come out of movie theater and it's like half an hour later and I'm thinking about what happened. And then I think, well, that didn't make that much sense. But I think that it's perfectly fine. A lot of people think of people holding the idiot ball. And I think the idiot ball is always bad because when you see that idiot ball, that's you recognizing it. That someone is acting out of character and then that's driving the plot.
And it very quickly breaks the immersion, like right in the moment.
Right. And I think that there are ways that you can write not rationally that break the rational rules, and it's still good writing.
Some examples of that could be seen in stories that are not trying to explain everything, that are purposely trying to keep certain things vague. There's a paragraph on the TV tropes page for Rational Fic. It says, the number of tropes Rational Fic attempts to avoid, which are on the bad writing index, might suggest there's some sort of universal principle of good writing, which is not the case. Even those tropes are not bad, and many Rational Fics fail to avoid them in any case, or fall into other traps. Lord of the Rings would not necessarily have benefited from a clearly explained magic system, nor the Threepenny Opera from a logical downer ending, nor the Dark Knight from making the Joker a well-intentioned extremist. So, some of those you can argue, like, maybe some people would like to read the Lord of the Rings with a clearly explained magic system. Or maybe some people would like to see a Batman story where the Joker is a well-intentioned extremist or has a justification for his worldview and actions besides just wanting to watch the world burn or for the laughs or whatever.
Yeah, I would definitely want to read that.
But the story works, like it still works without that. It still works just as well with the Joker as a agent of chaos or with the Lord of the Rings as magic being a obscure system.
Yeah, and I think one of the bullet points, that the rules of the fictional world are sane and consistent. A lot of rational fiction, to me, is that those rules are exposed, and it's not just the audience's willing suspension of disbelief. Because in Lord of the Rings, when reading that, the audience members will assume that the rules of magic are sane and consistent, that they make sense somehow to someone, but they never are exposed to what those rules are. They just is assumed that those rules are there somewhere in the back.
Right. And a lot of fun can come from deconstructions or reconstructions, come from kind of poking holes in a world's structure, finding things that don't make sense, explaining them in ways that make sense. And those don't necessarily have to be rational stories or rationalist stories, but they still operate on the same idea that, like, we can find ways to make this more rational or identify what's irrational about this. And what makes them rational stories would be the reconstruction of them in a fashion that deliberately attempts to create I hesitate to say better story, but maybe a story that is consistent with itself.
Yeah.
And doesn't take it for granted that the unexplained things will just be forgotten or not addressed.
Right. And the deconstruction, reconstruction aspect, there's, I think, a good reason that they tie in so closely to rational fiction, and that's why a lot of rational fiction that you see is deconstruction or a reconstruction.
Yeah. There's also been a lot of discussion about the kinds of stories and mediums that lend themselves to rationality. And in this podcast, we're probably going to be talking for the most part about writing, since we both primarily are writers in this genre. But we can also discuss, video games, movies, TV shows, and all those things while keeping in mind that it might be harder or easier for some of them to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's a example of a story that you thought while you watched it for the first time, like this would be really great as a rational story?
Yeah. I think most of the ones that I had that strong desire for, I've written. Um, like like Superman. I had always thought Superman gets a lot of crap as being a boring, invincible hero, and that's not that's true in some of the comic books, but it's not true in all of them for Superman. And I had always loved the Superman stories that took him as this big, invincible force that still was human and had human flaws, and
Hmm.
people would react to him in the way that they would react to a god instead of just saying, "Oh, thanks, Superman, for saving my cat," and then he flies in
Right.
the air. Terminator was another one, and I wrote Branches on the Tree of Time because I liked the Terminator movies, especially the second one,
Hmm.
but they aren't really that much about time travel,
Or AI for that matter.
or yeah, or AI for that matter. Especially Genesis, they're just using that as a conceit
Yeah.
so that they can have action scenes and chase scenes, and it's not about the things that it's ostensibly
Hmm.
about. So
That's another kind of important difference. If something is seen or heard in a rational story, if it comes up in a rationalist story, then the understanding is that it won't just be there as a prop or a convenience to the writing or the stories or the characters getting from point A to point B. So if, for example, in the Pokemon story, you've got this whole world full of technology, this whole world that's really only made possible because of specific technology. And there's lots of different aspects of the Pokemon world that you can rationalize and try to have make sense. The elephant in the room is the technology of the Pokeball itself.
right,
And it's one of the major struggles is to try and explain how the Pokeball would be used in a society that is clearly making use of it without having them all just be idiots that aren't using it in much more efficient or understandable ways. But beyond that, also there's clearly the processing power that's required for Pokeball technology to work. Like, you got to explain that in terms of how far their computers have advanced, in terms of how able they are to use their computers for far more constructive means than they do in the games or the TV show. Um, at some point there's the Pokemon Porygon, who's an artificially created Pokemon, according to the canon, and the question has to arise, like in a rational story. Okay, well, if they're able to create Porygon, what else can they create? Or why is Porygon the only one they've created, and why don't they make better Pokemon than Porygon? And those questions ideally should be answered at some point in a rational story about Pokemon, because otherwise you're just ignoring things that are convenient to ignore, which happens far too often in non-rational fiction. Iron Man, for example, they went a few movies with this quite advanced artificial intelligence assisting Tony Stark in, making the Iron Man suits and reading his emails and running his household and everything like that. And it wasn't until the second Avengers movie, Age of Ultron, where he basically has the idea like, hey, why don't I just make well, the third Iron Man movie actually is where he started thinking, why don't I just make a bunch of suits and have them, why do people need to be in the suits? Why don't I just have an AI direct them? And Age of Ultron was the movie where he was basically like, for the whole world, it's better to have artificial intelligence protecting it with, you know, powered suits rather than relying on just a handful of superpowered beings.
yeah,
And that's one of the reasons a lot of people, didn't necessarily like the third Iron Man movie or didn't like Age of Ultron as much as the others. But for me, watching those movies, like the fact that they brought up those questions and in some way tried to address them is really appreciated. Like I love when movies try to do that or media tries to do that.
yeah. I think the genre of the humongous mecha is
Hmm.
probably one of the worst offenders in terms of what they want is these humongous mechas that look vaguely like people most of the time, fighting each other in space or whatever. And they do the minimum necessary to justify it sometimes not even that. The audience is just asked to accept that they're humongous mecha fighting each other in space.
Hmm.
That's our premise. It's what we're going with. Don't try to think about what kind of technologies are
Hmm.
necessary for fabrication and motor control and that kind of thing. I think you can get away with a little bit of that in rational fiction.
Yeah.
You don't need to. We'll talk about magic systems in a future episode, but I don't think that you need to drill straight down to the like atomic or quantum layer to explain things. But I think you do need to have coherent explanations.
Right. And all that can be just part of the sci-fi genre, where there are hand-waved and not fully explained technology because they're impossible or incredibly advanced. The main difference in rational fiction would be that someone has to raise maybe not the obvious questions to all viewers, but the ones that should be raised and should be obvious in a real world where that's really something that's going on. So if they're trying to build these giant mechas for fighting, is this really the most efficient use of resources? Like, why is one giant mecha better than a dozen smaller, more agile fighter jets or spaceships that have the same type of weaponry that would use the same resources?
Yeah.
And again, that's not to say that this is the only kind of genre that has enjoyable plots or that every plot has to be rational to be enjoyable. When you mentioned drilling down to the quantum level, the example that comes to mind immediately is, I'm going to butcher the name, I'm sure, but Gurren Lagann.
Yep.
I don't know how to pronounce the full name. Um, Very much the kind of show that openly acknowledges and flaunts the fact that it is irrational, and yet for many people it is still a very enjoyable show. It's very entertaining. It can be inspiring for many people, and it just like there's a very token effort to explain anything in it. But at one point, the giant mechas are literally throwing galaxies at each other,
Yeah.
and clearly ridiculous things like that can still make for a good story, as long as the writers aren't taking themselves too seriously and are acknowledging like this is all rule of cool.
Yeah.
Um,
And a lot of stories will give you just enough explanation so that they can
mhm.
say, "Hey, we explained it. Don't ask any more questions." It's just to up the suspension of disbelief. It's not about actually having an explanation for it. They'll just say something something quantum, and that's all we need for time travel or computers or anything.
Right. Or they'll hang a lampshade on it and have one of the characters in the story just say, "But how does that work?" And then either brush the question off or have it be in a moment where they don't really have time to answer it.
Yep.
So they are basically nodding to the audience and being like, "Look, we know this doesn't really make sense, but just go with it." And I was a huge fan of MST3K as a kid, and one of the major lines in their opening theme song is basically just sit back and relax and don't worry about all the science questions that are making you wonder how this is even possible.
Yeah.
And the real struggle of rational writing can be phrased in some ways as how do we make a story entertaining while not ignoring those questions or ignoring as few of those questions as possible.
Yeah.
Because we, generally speaking, are an audience that does want smarter stories, does want stories that try to address these questions, does like to learn through our entertainment.
Right. And I want fiction that's about logistics and like trade treaties. If you have a teleporter
Right.
who is like going from America to Europe, what about like borders and customs and invasive species they might be carrying and things like that? And you don't really get much of that. And that's what I like about rational fiction is that you can get that, especially in writing, because you can take a break from the plot for a while to talk about invasive species
Yeah.
are introduced by a teleporter.
Yeah. And for people who aren't really familiar with what rational writing is, and for rationality as a genre, it basically came about because Eliza Yudkowsky wrote HPMOR, Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, and this was such a unique kind of story that there was a huge hunger for. And the numbers speak for themselves. It's one of the widest read and widest reviewed fan fictions, at the very least Harry Potter fan fictions.
Yep.
And I think it just goes to show that, as much as there is a huge audience for the blow things up and don't ask questions stories out there, there's many people who want smarter stories and watch and experience stories that are more in depth,
Yeah.
And ask more questions and answer more questions.
Yeah, and you want to learn something from a story, or failing that, you want to feel like you've learned something.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the reasons I like to just occasionally, while writing a story, dip into something that was interesting me and that I researched. And
Mm-hmm.
it's relevant to the story, but here it is presented to the reader. There's a part in Metropolitan Man that is talking about these orphan trains that they had in the 1920s, where they had all these farmers who needed labor in the Midwest, and they had all these young unwanted children in orphanages in the big cities, so they stuck these young kids on these trains and made these orphan trains that would go out to the Midwest, and these kids would be adopted in as workers for the farm. And that's really fascinating to me how their society did that back in the 1920s. And
Right.
to me, rational fiction is to some extent about exposing the reader to ideas they might not have seen before. Little bits of history I really enjoy, bits of science, things like that.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of the challenges of rational fiction, because the process of writing it is what this podcast is what it's going to be largely about. And we're going to have, I'm sure many episodes on very specific things. Some of those things are, for example, the process of writing characters smarter than yourself, the process of knowing things, having characters know things that you don't know. And many writers obviously have to research a ton. Anyone who writes any kind of cop book either was a journalist themselves or a cop themselves or knows cops. Someone, they have resources in the real world they can talk to and try to get the details right and the facts right. The science fiction genre obviously has people that are trying to explain or use real scientific examples in their work. And what primarily, like all those things obviously still apply to the rational genre, to the rationalist genre. We want to make anything that's mentioned, whether it takes place in this world or the past or anything like that, be as realistic and truthful as possible. But the unique element would be, I guess, human psychology, human rationality, the biases, what makes people think the way they do, what makes people act the way they do, systems of human interaction, government, society, things like that.
Yeah, and I think research is one of the big hurdles in writing rational fiction, because if you're writing about a subject that you don't know that much about, you want to do your background research so that it passes the sniff test at the very least, and ideally so that an expert could look at it and say, yeah, that's how things are. I think the other big thing that I find challenging is portraying human psychology in a non-rational person, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Or portraying someone's flawed reasoning without them understanding that it's flawed.
Right. It's a great way of putting how hard the struggle sometimes can be to have two characters that have either the same information and different values, or different values but the same information, and both of those people can make very different decisions and lead to very different actions without necessarily being maybe wrong. Maybe one of them is wrong and maybe one of them is right, but they both of their actions and their beliefs and things make sense from an outside observer.
Right.
No one's just thinking like, well, that's dumb that he does that, or it doesn't make sense that he does that, or he should have done this instead. Like, yeah, maybe you can say it's better if he done this, but with the data they had, with the values they had, what they did make sense. And that's very important to me, at least as a reader of rational fiction and non-rational fiction.
I find different values to be the easier one than different processes. Different processes, if you're trying to approach a problem through a different method of thinking. Because someone who has different values than me, I can at least think to myself, okay, if I had those values, what would I do? And I find that process fairly easy. But it's hard for me to think, okay, if I went through a different process to arrive at results, what would that process be? That's probably my biggest challenge in writing. I've been trying to do more of that, more of alternate viewpoints.
Also because it's a fairly obscure thing. I mean, if you want to know more about how police work is done, ask a policeman. If you want to know more about how, forensics work, study forensics. If you want to know more about some kind of scientific field, it's there. It's available to learn about. But the process of why people think the way they do and how they reach their decisions, psychology is a softer science than many other ones, very subjective between people, and it makes it hard to get universal principles of thought and action, despite lots of really good work by a number of psychiatrists and psychologists and economists and things like that have tried to answer these questions and make models that fit.
Right. Yeah. So that's what's difficult about
Hmm.
rational fiction. What do you think the easy parts are?
The easy parts. I would say the feedback I get and editing based off of it, because entertaining people is at least it's fairly subjective. Some people will like what you write, some people won't like what you write. Hopefully, you can just write the best story you can, and some people will enjoy it. But did I communicate an idea well enough for people to understand it? Did I integrate knowledge well enough for it not to break immersion? Some subjectivity there still, but there's still guiding posts I can put for how well I'm doing, and that makes it easier for me then to focus and edit and achieve goals in writing.
Okay. Yeah. I think for me, explaining things I find easy and gratifying. I was going to be, when I was in college, I was going to be a teacher for a while because I always enjoyed that part of it. I enjoyed tutoring. I enjoyed getting concepts across to people. And I don't think there's terribly much of that if you're not writing rationally.
But yeah, just teaching in general I find very rewarding in my day-to-day life, in my role as a therapist sometimes when it's called for, things like that. Do you have a perspective on the growth of the rational writing community? Like, do you think it's something that rationalists in general would be focused on it, or interested in it, or do you think it's something that is going to be gaining more popularity, is going to be gaining more of an audience than the initial rationalist community?
I think it'll, to some extent, has gone beyond that because I occasionally there will be posts on the rational subreddit and people will be like, well, what's less wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And they just don't,
Right.
they don't know. I think right now the big thing in the like Tumblrverse and on Facebook and other places is that people are now rationalist adjacent rather than rationalist qua rationalist,
Mm-hmm.
right? They sort of identify with that spirit or that community, but they don't want to go the full distance.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Kind of
and
like the, go ahead.
and in science fiction, there's this division of hard science fiction and soft science fiction, and I think that's to some extent a proxy for rational as we understand it in this genre. And so I think there's a demand that goes outside of that. It's just a matter of people finding it and understanding it. And we don't really have that firm a set of community norms or genre norms right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly just in terms of the stuff that's been published and that people have read, and that these things are all sort of clustered together.
Right. I was thinking kind of the same thing with science as a thing. You know, there's scientists who perform science. There's people who work like engineers or people who study scientific principles or make use of scientific findings to do their day-to-day work and might be more scientifically minded than the general population. But there's also many people who are not scientists, have never done any kind of scientific work, but they value what they believe at least science is. They value the scientific worldview. They value the science as a culture, kind of. Sometimes not to very great outcomes. You know, there was a Facebook page I've every so often become aware of because of my friends on Facebook called I Fucking Love Science
Yeah,
or something like that. Yeah, and many of the things that show up on that Facebook page, not only not scientific, but kind of should not even be in the same Venn diagram as anything scientific.
right.
But it's still a kind of a nice.
Yeah, I am 30 years old now, and I'm definitely one of the big beneficiaries of geekdom becoming cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think science does benefit, like science in general does benefit
Mm-hmm.
from geekdom being cool, but a lot of that is surface level. That
Right.
people don't actually love science as it is.
Yeah, no, science is hard.
Yeah. They enjoy the idea of science or things that stimulate that part of their brain where science
Mm-hmm.
might go.
And people like being right.
Yeah.
People like being on the right side of cultural issues. People like being able to say, well, my beliefs are backed by science, and all the top scientists believe what I believe. So obviously, I'm better, or I'm doing a better job of filtering my beliefs without necessarily doing the hard work of making sure that's actually true.
Right.
And the same can be said in a rational movement or rationality. There's many people who are doing the hard work and want to better themselves and want to improve their rationality, and that's great. And there's lots of people who appreciate all those things and are kind of rational adjacent, like you said, which is also great. And hopefully some of those people move further into understanding rationality and becoming rationalists to some degree themselves. And as long as more and more people value what rationality is, I think that's the best overall benefit.
Yeah, and a lot of people come to rational fiction just because that's the kind of fiction that they like. They like
Right.
that thinky fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and that's fine. I don't begrudge that. That's great.
Yeah.
More readers. So
More people also thinking about media in a way that can be beneficial.
yeah.
And there's a clear hunger for more cerebral media, or media that focuses more on knowledge rather than action, even if it's only superficial, like Sherlock on BBC, Limitless and its smart characters. House is actually a much better example.
Yeah.
They have the character of the super know-it-all. Not necessarily rational works, not necessarily rationalists in those works, but still valuing intelligence and figuring things out.
Yeah.
Which is ostensibly good. So what do you think the benefits of rational writing or rationality as a genre of fiction? Is there something that you hope for the rational movement or the rational writing community?
I really enjoy the analytical mindset. I think that's a very helpful thing to have.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are completely uncritical in their beliefs. I get into this argument online a lot where people just will go with their tribal affiliations and like upvote whatever, or something will happen in the world and they'll immediately come out and just make this uncritical statement that's based on their pre-existing beliefs.
Right.
And if we can just tamp that down a tiny bit, I would be incredibly pleased. If people would just take a moment and think, well, things are complex.
Yeah. Things are complex. What do I know? Why do I think I know it? Raising the sandy waterline is, I believe, how it's been referred to by others like the Bayesian Conspiracy Podcast and Yudkowsky and others in the Less Wrong community. And whatever work that rational fiction can do in raising the sandy waterline is something that I hope, gets done, and is one of the reasons that I think it's valuable as a pursuit, above and beyond all the general things that I think are valuable about fiction in general.
Yeah. One of the things that I really like about rational fiction is the deconstruction and reconstruction aspect. That method of looking at fiction and how fiction itself works and taking apart that artistic license.
Yeah.
And a big part of that are tropes.
Yeah.
And we'll be talking about that next time.
For those of you not familiar with tvtropes.org, the website, it's probably one of the most time-consuming but well worth the experience websites that I know of. You can get lost there just reading about all your favorite shows and books and pieces of media and the tropes that they have in common and what they mean.
Yeah. So that'll be next time. Tropes, what they are, how to use them, which ones to avoid.
And which ones rational fiction sometimes can fall into itself as a genre.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for listening, and hope you tune in next time.
Okay.
Bye.